The morning mist clung to the Afghan mountains like a gray shroud, obscuring the jagged peaks that stretched endlessly across the horizon. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her scope for the third time in 10 minutes, her calloused fingers moving with practiced precision despite the cold that had seeped through her gear hours ago. The rocky outcrop where she lay provided perfect concealment, but the wind was picking up and she could feel it tugging at her ghillie suit. 300 meters below, her ranger unit moved through the narrow valley like shadows against the pale stone. Captain Rodriguez led the 8-man patrol, their mission simple on paper, but deadly in execution: locate and neutralize a high-value Taliban commander who had been coordinating attacks against coalition forces for the past 6 months. Intelligence suggested he was hiding in a compound 2 clicks east, using the treacherous terrain as natural protection. Maria had volunteered for Overwatch duty, as she always did. At 28, she was the youngest staff sergeant in her company, but her reputation with a rifle had earned her respect that transcended rank. The other Rangers called her Ghost for her ability to appear and disappear without a trace, leaving only the memory of impossibly accurate shots in her wake. Through her scope, she watched Rodriguez signal the squad to halt near a cluster of boulders. Something wasn't right. The valley was too quiet, even for this remote corner of Helmand Province. No birds sang from the scrubby vegetation. No insects buzzed in the warming air. After 18 months of deployments, Maria had learned to trust these subtle warnings that screamed danger to those who knew how to listen. She keyed her radio, speaking in barely audible whispers. Overwatch to Alpha. Valley's clean of civilians, but something feels off. Recommend you hold position while I glass the ridgelines. Rodriguez's voice crackled back through her earpiece. Copy, Overwatch. We're seeing fresh footprints here. Multiple sets, heading east toward the target building. Kabir Guy moved his security detail. Maria began a systematic sweep of the surrounding terrain, her scope moving in careful arcs as she searched for any sign of enemy presence. The mountains offered countless hiding spots, caves, overhangs, and natural fortifications that had sheltered fighters for thousands of years. She paused at a glint of metal on the far ridge, adjusting her focus until she could make out the distinctive shape of an AK-47 barrel protruding from behind a rock formation. Contact, she whispered urgently. Multiple fighters on the eastern ridge, approximately 800 meters from your position. I count at least 6, possibly more. They have Overwatch on your route. Below, she saw Rodriguez freeze, then slowly motion his men toward better cover. The Rangers moved like ghosts themselves, flowing between rocks and shadows until they were protected from direct observation. But Maria could see what they couldn't. The trap was much larger than any of them had imagined. As she continued her surveillance, more enemy positions revealed themselves. A fighter adjusting his position here, a muzzle flash reflecting sunlight there, the subtle movement of fabric that didn't match the natural patterns of the landscape. With growing horror, she realized that her unit wasn't walking into an ambush. They had already entered a killing field that had been carefully prepared over days or weeks. Alpha, this is Overwatch. You need to abort immediately. I'm seeing fighting positions all around your location. This is a trap. Rodriguez's response was grim, but unsurprising. Negative, Overwatch. We've got movement behind us now. At least a dozen contacts blocking our exit route. We're boxed in. Maria felt her heart rate spike as she counted muzzle flashes and movement signatures around the valley. 15, 20, 25 enemy fighters. More appeared every few seconds as they abandoned concealment, confident that their prey was trapped. Through her scope, she could see some of them already moving into flanking positions, preparing to enfilade her trapped comrades with crossfire that would turn the rocky depression into a slaughter pen. The tactical situation was hopeless. 9 Rangers against what appeared to be an entire company of Taliban fighters, positioned on high ground with prepared fields of fire. Even if close air support was available, which it wasn't in this remote location, the enemy was too close to her unit for effective strikes. Artillery was similarly useless. Any fire mission accurate enough to hit the enemy positions would also kill the Rangers. "Ghost, what do you see up there?" Rodriguez's voice carried the weight of command, but Maria could hear the underlying tension. He knew as well as she did that they were looking at a potential catastrophe. Maria made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. Instead of providing the detailed tactical assessment that regulations demanded, she gave her captain something infinitely more valuable: hope wrapped in quiet confidence. "I see targets, sir. Lots of them. Stay low and trust me to work. I'm going to start with the crew-served weapons and work my way down. When I give the word, move fast and move together toward the western slope. I'll clear a path." She could almost hear Rodriguez thinking through their limited options. Air support was 30 minutes out at best, assuming it was even available. Reinforcements were hours away across terrain that would turn any rescue mission into another potential disaster. The only advantage they had was Maria's elevated position and the element of surprise that came with it. The enemy knew the Rangers were trapped, but they had no idea that death was watching them through a high-powered scope from over a kilometer away. "Understood, Ghost. We're trusting you to get us out of this. Call your shots." Maria settled into her shooting position, her breathing automatically slowing as years of training took control. The morning sun was rising behind her, which meant she wouldn't have to worry about scope glare giving away her position. The wind had steadied to a consistent 8-mile-per-hour crosswind from the northeast, manageable for someone of her skill level, even at extreme range. She identified her first target, a fighter manning what appeared to be a Pecan machine gun on the eastern ridge. The weapon was positioned to sweep the entire valley floor, and eliminating it would remove the single greatest threat to her unit's mobility. Through her scope, she could see the gunner adjusting his aim, preparing to rain heavy fire down on the trapped Rangers. The range was just over 1,100 meters. Not quite the 1,200-meter shot that would become legend, but close enough to test every skill she had developed over years of training and combat. She adjusted her scope for distance and wind, then settled into the mental zone that separated snipers from ordinary soldiers. Time seemed to slow as her world contracted to nothing but the crosshairs, the target, and the rhythm of her own heartbeat. The machine gunner shifted slightly, and Maria could see his face clearly through her optics. He was young, probably no older than she was, with a scraggly beard and eyes that held the same professional focus she recognized in her own reflection. For a split second, she felt the weight of what she was about to do, not the tactical necessity, which was clear, but the human cost that came with every trigger pull. Then, she thought about Rodriguez and the 8 other Rangers trapped in the valley below, men who trusted her to get them home to their families, and her hesitation evaporated like morning mist. She exhaled slowly, let her breath settle at natural respiratory pause, and gently squeezed the trigger. The rifle's recoil was familiar and comforting, like the embrace of an old friend. Through her scope, she watched the .308 round cover the distance in just over a second, striking the machine gunner center mass and spinning him away from his weapon. The other fighters hadn't even registered the sound of her shot before she was already acquiring her next target. A group of 3 fighters was positioning themselves behind a natural stone barrier, preparing to provide covering fire for an assault team. Maria put her crosshairs on the leader, an older man with the bearing of a veteran who was directing the others' movements. Another shot, another hit. The man dropped immediately, and his companions dove for cover, their coordinated advance dissolving into confusion. "First 2 down," she reported calmly, already scanning for her next priority target. "Machine gun is neutralized. I'm working on the command element now." Below in the valley, she could see Rodriguez and his men using the confusion to improve their positions, moving from one piece of cover to another as enemy fire began to slacken. But she knew the respite would be temporary. The Taliban fighters would reorganize quickly once they understood what was happening, and then they would begin hunting for her position. Maria had perhaps 10 minutes before the enemy's numerical advantage would overwhelm her ability to protect the trapped Rangers. In that time, she would have to eliminate enough fighters to create a corridor of escape, all while remaining undetected in her overwatch position. It was the kind of impossible task that separated good soldiers from legends. She settled back in her scope and began the deadly work that would either save her unit or get them all killed. In the distance, she could hear the echo of her shots bouncing off the mountain walls, a sound that would haunt the dreams of enemy fighters for years to come. The ghost had awakened, and the hunt had begun. Maria's third shot took down a spotter who was trying to coordinate fire from multiple positions using a handheld radio. The man had been crouched behind a boulder roughly 900 meters away, completely confident in his concealment until the heavy .308 round found him through a gap barely 6 inches wide. The radio clattered down the rocky slope, its antenna bent at an unnatural angle. The enemy's response was swift but unfocused. Automatic weapons fire erupted from at least a dozen positions, spraying bullets wildly across the valley in the general direction they thought the shots had come from. The problem was that Maria's elevated position and the acoustic properties of the mountain terrain made it nearly impossible to pinpoint her location. Her muzzle blast echoed off half a dozen rock faces, creating the auditory illusion that death was coming from everywhere and nowhere. She used the noise to mask her movement, shifting 30 meters to a secondary position she had identified earlier. The new angle gave her a clear view of a cluster of fighters who had been using a dried riverbed as an approach route. Through her scope, she counted 6 men moving in tactical formation, their AK-47s held ready as they bounded from cover to cover. "Contact, northwest approach," she radioed to Rodriguez. 6 fighters using the wadi for concealment. "I can see them, but they'll be on your flank in about 3 minutes if they maintain current pace." Rodriguez's voice carried the strain of command under fire. "Copy, Ghost. We're taking heavy fire from the east. Can you shift some of that pressure off us?" Maria was already moving her crosshairs to a new target, a fighter with an RPG who was setting up for a shot that would devastate the Rangers' covered position. The range was just over 1,000 meters, and the angle required her to thread the needle between 2 rock formations. She compensated for the increased distance and the tricky wind conditions that swirled unpredictably through the mountain passes. The RPG gunner was focused entirely on his target below, unaware that death was calculating windage and elevation a kilometer away. Maria controlled her breathing, let the crosshairs settle naturally on center mass, and fired. The shot was perfect. The fighter pitched forward, and the RPG round detonated harmlessly against the rocks as his dying fingers pulled the trigger. For down, but the math was still working against them. For every fighter Maria eliminated, it seemed like 2 more appeared from hidden positions throughout the surrounding ridgelines. She was beginning to understand the true scope of the trap her unit had walked into. This wasn't a hasty ambush by a local cell. It was a carefully planned operation that had probably taken weeks to set up. The realization brought with it a cold fury that Maria channeled into deadly precision. Someone had leaked information about the patrol route, or the intelligence about the target location had been deliberately fed to coalition forces. Either way, her Rangers were paying the price for someone else's betrayal. She shifted to a new target, a group of 3 fighters who were attempting to maneuver around the southern approach. These men moved with the coordination of professional soldiers rather than the enthusiasm of militia fighters. Maria put her first shot into the lead man, watched his companions dive for cover, then waited with the patience of a true predator. Patience was a sniper's greatest weapon, more valuable than the finest rifle or the most sophisticated optics. Maria had learned this lesson during endless hours of training, lying motionless in uncomfortable positions while instructors try to break her concentration with everything from simulated artillery barges to actual insects crawling across her face. Now that training paid dividends as she remained perfectly still, waiting for her targets to make the fatal mistake of assuming they were safe. It took almost 3 minutes, but Eventually, one of the fighters raised his head to scan for threats. Maria was ready. Her shot took him cleanly, and before his companion could react, she had already cycled the bolt and acquired a new target. The third man broke cover entirely, running for a position that would give him a better angle on the trapped rangers. He made it almost 15 meters before Maria's bullet found him. 7 confirmed kills, but the enemy was adapting to her tactics. She could see fighters beginning to move in groups, using coordinated suppression fire to cover their movements. Several positions had stopped shooting entirely, which meant their occupants were either dead or trying to locate her firing position through careful observation. "Ghost, we need to move soon." Rodriguez's voice carried urgency. "They're bringing up mortars on the eastern ridge. We've got maybe 5 minutes before they start dropping rounds on our position." Maria swung her scope toward the eastern ridge and immediately spotted the mortar team. 3 men were assembling a lightweight mortar system, working with the efficiency of soldiers who had done this countless times before. The weapon itself wasn't particularly accurate at this range, but it didn't need to be. A few well-placed rounds would drive the Rangers from their covered positions, exposing them to the crossfire that waited in every direction. The range to the mortar position was nearly 1,200 meters, the absolute limit of her effective range with the standard 7.6 2mm NATO ammunition she carried. At that distance, bullet drop will be measured in meters rather than inches, and wind drift could easily push her shots off target by several feet. It was the kind of shot that most snipers wouldn't even attempt, the kind that existed primarily in movies and the boastful stories of wannabe warriors. But Maria Santos wasn't most snipers. She was a graduate of the Army Sniper School at Fort Benning, had completed additional training at the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School, and had spent the last 18 months perfecting her craft in the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan. More importantly, she had something that couldn't be taught in any school: the absolute certainty that failure meant watching her fellow Rangers die. She made the calculation quickly, but carefully. Maximum range meant maximum bullet drop, which she compensated for by aiming nearly 3 feet high. The crosswind would push her shot to the left, requiring her to aim almost 2 feet to the right of her intended target. The bullet would take nearly 2 seconds to reach its destination, during which any movement by her target would result in a clean miss. The mortar team was working frantically to set up their weapon, clearly aware that time was running short. Maria could see the team leader, a bearded man in his 40s who moved with the confidence of long experience, directing the other 2 as they leveled the base plate and prepared the first round for firing. She settled into her shooting position one more time, forcing herself to ignore the sporadic rifle fire that continued to echo through the valley. The morning sun was higher now, creating heat shimmer that would affect her shot's trajectory in ways that were impossible to calculate precisely. She would have to trust her instincts and the thousands of hours of training that had become muscle memory. The team leader stepped back from the mortar, clearly preparing to drop the first round down the tube. Maria estimated she had perhaps 10 seconds before the weapon fired, sending high explosive death raining down on her trapped comrades. 10 seconds to make a shot that would test every skill she had ever learned. She exhaled slowly, let her breathing settle, and squeezed the trigger with the deliberate care of a surgeon making a critical incision. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and she immediately began tracking the shot through her scope, watching for the telltale dust puff that would indicate impact. For nearly 2 seconds, nothing happened. The mortar team continued their work, unaware that death was traveling toward them at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Then, the team leader suddenly staggered, clutching his chest as the .308 round found its mark with devastating precision. He collapsed across the mortar tube, his weight disrupting the weapon's careful alignment. The other team members dove for cover, abandoning their weapon in the face of this impossible shot from an unseen enemy. Maria was already shifting to new targets, but she allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. 8 confirmed kills, and the immediate threat of indirect fire had been eliminated. "Mortar threat neutralized," she reported calmly. "But I'm seeing movement all along the ridge lines." They're repositioning for a coordinated assault. You need to move now, while I can still provide covering fire. Rodriguez didn't hesitate. Alpha Team, we're moving to Rally Point Bravo. Overwatch, give us everything you've got for the next 60 seconds. Maria began firing as fast as she could acquire targets, abandoning the careful precision of her earlier shots for rapid engagement of any fighter who showed himself. A man with an AK-47 trying to flank from the north shot. A fighter attempting to set up a new machine gun position shot. Two men carrying what appeared to be additional ammunition for the abandoned mortar. Both shot in rapid succession. The bolt action of her rifle became a mechanical rhythm. Acquire target, fire, cycle bolt, acquire target, fire, cycle bolt. Her training took over completely, years of muscle memory, allowing her to operate the weapon without conscious thought while her eyes and mind focused entirely on target identification and engagement. In 60 seconds of concentrated fire, she eliminated 6 more fighters and forced at least a dozen others to abandon their positions or seek deeper cover. The suppressive effect was devastating. Across the ridgelines, muzzle flashes that had been constant suddenly became sporadic as enemy fighters realized that showing themselves meant almost certain death. Below in the valley, Rodriguez led his team in a desperate sprint toward the western slope, using every piece of available cover as they bounded from position to position. Maria tracked their movement through her peripheral vision while continuing to engage targets that threatened their escape route. A fighter appeared on the ridge directly above the Ranger's path, his AK-47 aimed down at the moving man. Maria's shot took him before he could fire a single round. Another enemy soldier tried to set up an ambush position behind a boulder that would have given him perfect enfilade of the escape route. He died before he could chamber his first round. Halfway to the rally point, Rodriguez reported, his voice steady despite the fact that he was running for his life under fire. Keep those heads down, Ghost. Maria was already doing exactly that, her rifle speaking with mechanical precision as she systematically eliminated any threat to her unit's withdrawal. But she could see the larger tactical picture developing, and it wasn't encouraging. The enemy was beginning to coordinate their response, with groups of fighters moving to cut off the Rangers' escape route, while others provided covering fire. She had perhaps 2 minutes before enemy reinforcements reached positions that would make the western slope as deadly as the valley floor. 2 minutes to kill enough fighters to keep the escape corridor open. 2 minutes to justify the faith that 9 men had placed in her ability to get them home alive. Maria Santos settled back behind her rifle and prepared to write her name in the history books. One impossible shot at a time, the enemy's counterattack came with the precision of a military operation rather than the chaotic assault of irregular fighters. Maria watched through her scope as groups of Taliban fighters began executing coordinated movement to cut off her unit's escape route. These weren't the poorly trained militia she had expected. They moved with the discipline of soldiers who had been fighting coalition forces for years, learning hard lessons about tactics and survival. A 8-man squad was advancing along the northern ridgeline, using fire and maneuver techniques that would have impressed instructors at Fort Benning. Half the group provided covering fire while the other half moved forward. Then, the roles reversed in a leapfrog pattern that made individual targeting extremely difficult. They were clearly trying to reach a position that would allow them to fire down on the Rangers as they climbed toward the rally point. Maria made a decision that violated every principle of sniper employment she had ever been taught. Instead of remaining concealed and picking individual targets, she was going to have to expose her position and engage multiple enemies in rapid succession. It was a tactical gamble that could easily get her killed, but the alternative was watching her entire unit get slaughtered in the open. She shifted to a position that gave her a clear field of fire along the ridgeline, knowing that her muzzle flashes would be visible to anyone who was looking in the right direction. The range varied from 800 to nearly 1,300 meters as the enemy fighters spread out across the terrain, requiring her to constantly adjust her point of aim for distance and wind conditions that changed with the mountain topography. Her first shot targeted the lead scout of the advancing squad, a fighter who was moving with the confidence of someone who believed he was beyond effective rifle range. The bullet struck him center mass, and he tumbled down the rocky slope in a cascade of loose stones. Before his companions could react, Maria had already shifted to a new target. The second fighter tried to take cover behind a boulder that looked substantial from his perspective, but left his legs exposed when viewed from Maria's elevated angle. Her shot shattered his femur, and his screams echoed off the mountain walls as his comrades abandoned their coordinated advance to drag him to safety. Contact north, Maria reported, cycling her bolt with mechanical precision. 8-man squad, trying to flank your route. I've got 2 down, but the others are adapting fast. Rodriguez's response came between bursts of automatic weapons fire. Copy, Ghost. We're taking fire from multiple positions. How much ammunition do you have left? Maria checked her ammunition supply with the practiced efficiency of someone whose life depended on accurate record-keeping. She had fired 23 rounds, leaving her with 17 in her current magazine, plus 2 spare magazines of 20 rounds each. 57 total rounds to eliminate what appeared to be at least 30 remaining enemy fighters. Enough, she replied simply, not wanting to burden her unit commander with mathematics that would only increase his stress level. In truth, she was facing the kind of target-rich environment that snipers dreamed about and dreaded in equal measure. Every shot had to count, because missing meant giving the enemy time to coordinate a response that would overwhelm her position. A new threat appeared on the eastern ridge, a 3-man crew carrying what appeared to be a recoilless rifle. The weapon was old, probably dating back to the Soviet occupation, but it was still capable of devastating any covered position the Rangers might use. Maria could see them setting up behind a natural rock formation that provided excellent protection from ground-level fire, but left them exposed to her elevated angle of attack. The range was just over 1,100 meters, and the weapon crew was working with the urgency of soldiers who understood that time was running short. Maria focused on the gunner, a thin man with graying hair who was adjusting the weapon's elevation with the careful attention of an experienced operator. She compensated for distance, and wind settled her breathing, and fired. The shot was perfect. The gunner collapsed across his weapon, and the other crew members immediately abandoned their position. But Maria could see more fighters moving along the ridge lines, and she knew that eliminating individual weapons crews was only buying time. The enemy had enough personnel to absorb significant casualties while still maintaining tactical pressure on her trapped unit. Ghost, we need a miracle here. Rodriguez's voice carried the weight of command responsibility. They're setting up a coordinated assault from 3 directions. We can hold them for maybe 5 more minutes, but after that, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Maria could see the tactical situation as clearly as he could. The enemy was using classic mountain warfare tactics, applying pressure from multiple directions while using the terrain to limit the Rangers' options for maneuver. It was a textbook example of how to destroy an isolated unit, executed with the kind of professional competence that spoke of extensive training and experience. But the enemy had made one critical miscalculation. They had planned their ambush around the assumption that they were fighting a conventional infantry patrol with conventional capabilities. They hadn't accounted for a sniper with the skill and determination to engage targets at extreme range under combat conditions that would challenge even the most experienced marksman. Maria made another tactical decision that would define the rest of the engagement. Instead of continuing to engage individual targets as they presented themselves, she was going to systematically eliminate the enemy's command and control structure. She had been trained to identify leadership through careful observation of body language, equipment, and tactical positioning. Now she was going to put that training to use in a way that would either break the enemy's coordination or reveal her position to every fighter on the mountainside. Through her scope, she identified her primary target, an older fighter with a radio who was positioned on a rock outcrop approximately 1,200 meters away. The man was clearly coordinating the movements of several groups, using hand signals and radio communications to synchronize the developing assault. He was also positioned at what Maria estimated to be the absolute limit of her effective range, requiring a shot that would test every skill she had ever developed. The mathematics were daunting. At 1,200 meters, her bullet would drop nearly 30 feet from the line of sight, requiring her to aim at a point well above her actual target. The crosswind would push the shot several feet to the left, and the flight time would be nearly 2.5 seconds, long enough for any movement by the target to result in a complete miss. But Maria had something that couldn't be quantified in ballistic tables or calculated through mathematical formulas. She had the absolute conviction that comes from knowing that failure isn't an option, that the lives of 8 men depended entirely on her ability to make an impossible shot under impossible conditions. She settled into her shooting position with the calm that comes from accepting the inevitable. Either she would make this shot, or she would watch her unit die. There are no other alternatives, no backup plans, no margin for error. Everything she had learned, everything she was, came down to the next few seconds. Through her scope, she could see the target clearly despite the enormous range. The enemy commander was studying a map, apparently coordinating final preparations for the assault that would overrun the Ranger's position. He was completely focused on his task, unaware that death was calculating range and windage from a mountain peak that seemed impossibly distant. Maria controlled her breathing, feeling her heart rate slow as years of training took control of her autonomic nervous system. The crosshairs settled naturally on a point 3 feet above and 2 feet to the right of her actual target, compensating for the ballistic realities that governed long-range shooting. The world contracted to nothing but the sight picture, the rhythm of her heartbeat, and the gentle pressure of her trigger finger. She exhaled slowly, let her breathing pause at its natural respiratory point, and squeezed the trigger with the deliberate care of someone performing surgery. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and she immediately began tracking the shot through her scope, watching for the impact that would either validate her calculations or confirm her failure. For nearly 3 seconds, nothing happened. The enemy commander continued studying his map, completely unaware that his death was traveling toward him at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Around the mountainside, the battle continued with the mechanical rhythm of automatic weapons fire and the occasional crack of rifles as other fighters engaged targets. Then, the commander suddenly stiffened, looked down at his chest in apparent confusion, and toppled backward off his rocky perch. The radio clattered down the mountainside, its antenna snapping as it bounced off the rocks. Across the ridgelines, Maria could see other fighters looking around in confusion as their coordination suddenly evaporated. 1,200 meters. The shot that would become legend, talked about in sniper schools and special operations units for decades to come. But Maria Santos didn't have time to appreciate the historical significance of what she had just accomplished. The enemy was already adapting to the loss of their commander, and she could see new leaders emerging to take control of the assault. Command element neutralized, she reported calmly, already scanning for her next target. But they're regrouping fast. You've got maybe 3 minutes before they coordinate a new assault. Rodriguez's voice carried new hope mixed with desperate urgency. Outstanding, Ghost. We're almost to the rally point. Can you keep their heads down for 60 more seconds? Maria was already doing exactly that, her rifle speaking with deadly authority as she engaged any fighter who showed himself. But she could see the larger tactical picture developing, and she knew that individual marksmanship, no matter how precise, couldn't solve the fundamental mathematical problem they faced. The enemy still had overwhelming numerical superiority, and they were learning to work around her capabilities. She had perhaps 50 rounds remaining, facing an enemy force that still numbered in the dozens. In the next few minutes, she would have to make every shot count in ways that redefine the possible, or watch her fellow Rangers pay the ultimate price for someone else's betrayal. The Ghost settled back behind her rifle and prepared for the final phase of a battle that would either write her name in the history books or add 8 more names to the casualty reports that arrived daily at Dover Air Force Base. The enemy's response to losing their commander was swift and professional. Maria watched through her scope as a new leader emerged, a younger fighter who immediately began reorganizing the scattered groups with sharp hand signals and decisive movement. The man had clearly been second in command, and he understood that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Within minutes, the Taliban fighters had adapted their tactics to account for the devastating sniper fire. Instead of moving in the open, they began using smoke grenades and coordinated suppression fire to mask their movements. Several groups started advancing using covered routes that limited Maria's fields of fire, working their way around her position like water flowing around stone. "They're getting smart," Maria muttered to herself, tracking a group of fighters who were using a dried stream bed to approach the Rangers' escape route. The natural depression provided excellent concealment from her elevated position, and by the time the enemy fighters emerged from cover, they would be too close to her unit for her to engage safely. She keyed her radio, speaking quickly but calmly. "Alpha, you've got a squad using the Wadi on your northern approach. 8 to 10 fighters moving fast. They'll be on top of you in about 2 minutes. Rodriguez's response was immediate. "We see them. Sergeant Martinez is setting up an ambush position. Can you take the pressure off our rear approach?" Maria swung her rifle toward the eastern ridge, where another group of fighters was preparing for a coordinated rush that would coincide with the flanking maneuver. These men were spread out across nearly 300 meters of rocky terrain, making individual targeting extremely difficult. She would have to engage them rapidly, accepting shots that were merely good instead of perfect, hoping to disrupt their timing enough to give her unit a chance. Her first shot targeted a fighter who was clearly acting as a spotter for the group, using binoculars to coordinate their movement. The range was just over 900 meters, manageable under normal conditions, but challenging when forced to engage quickly. Maria compensated for distance and wind, fired, and immediately shifted to a new target without waiting to confirm the hit. The second fighter was moving between positions when Maria's bullet found him, spinning him around and sending him tumbling down a rocky slope. Before his companions could react, she had already acquired a third target, a man with an RPG who was preparing to provide fire support for the assault. Shot after shot, Maria worked her way across the enemy formation with mechanical precision. But even as she eliminated individual fighters, she could see the larger tactical picture developing in ways that favored the enemy. They had enough personnel to absorb significant casualties while still maintaining pressure from multiple directions, and they were using the terrain expertly to limit her effectiveness. "Contact north," came Martinez's voice over the radio, followed immediately by the distinctive sound of automatic weapons fire. The ambush had been sprung, but Maria could see through her scope that more enemy fighters were moving to support their trapped comrades. The battle was rapidly becoming a race between her ability to eliminate threats and the enemy's ability to mass enough personnel to overwhelm her unit's defensive positions. A new threat emerged on the western ridge, a 4-man crew carrying what appeared to be a heavy machine gun. The weapon was old, but functional, and once emplaced, it would dominate the entire escape route with devastating enfilade fire. Maria could see the crew working frantically to set up their weapon before the Rangers could complete their withdrawal. The range was just under 1,000 meters, challenging but manageable. Maria focused on the gunner first, a heavy-set man who was assembling the weapon with practiced efficiency. Her shot took him cleanly, but before she could acquire the assistant gunner, the remaining crew members had dragged their weapon behind cover. "Machine gun crew on the western ridge," she reported. "Weapon is mobile, but I forced them to relocate. They'll be back up in 60 seconds. Rodriguez's voice carried increasing strain. "Copy, Ghost. We're the rally point, but Martinez's team is pinned down. They can't break contact without support." Maria could see the tactical situation clearly through her scope. Martinez and 2 other Rangers were trapped in a rocky depression, surrounded by at least 6 enemy fighters who were using superior numbers to maintain constant pressure. The range was just over 800 meters, close enough for precision shooting, but complicated by the fact that the enemy and friendly forces were intermixed in a way that made target identification extremely difficult. She studied the situation carefully, identifying individual fighters by their equipment and positioning. The enemy soldiers were using captured American gear mixed with traditional Afghan weapons, making visual identification challenging. But Maria had trained for exactly this scenario, close-quarters battle with a margin for error measured in inches rather than feet. Her first shot targeted a fighter who was attempting to maneuver around Martinez's left flank. The man was carrying an AK-47 with distinctive wood furniture, and his movement patterns clearly marked him as hostile. Maria's bullet struck him center mass, and he dropped immediately. Before his companions could react, she had already shifted to his second target. The engagement became a deadly chess game, with Maria eliminating enemy fighters one by one, while they tried to coordinate a rush that would overwhelm the trapped Rangers. Each shot had to be perfect, not just accurate, but timed to disrupt the enemy's coordination and prevent them from achieving local fire superiority. One down, she called, cycling her bolts smoothly. Second target, Eastern approach, AK with a drum magazine. Her bullet found its mark, and another fighter fell. But Maria could see reinforcements moving along multiple ridge lines, converging on the contact area with the kind of coordination that spoke of professional military training. She was facing the tactical reality that every sniper dreaded: too many targets, not enough ammunition, and time running out. "Ghost, we're taking heavy fire here." Martinez's voice was tight with stress. "They're massing for final assault. I count at least 8 more moving up the southern approach." Maria swung her rifle toward the southern ridge and immediately confirmed Martinez's assessment. 8 fighters were advancing in 2 teams, using fire and maneuver to close the distance while providing mutual support. They were clearly preparing for a coordinated rush that would overwhelm the defensive position through sheer weight of numbers. She began engaging the southern approach with rapid, precise fire. A fighter with an RPG went down first, his weapon clattering uselessly down the rocky slope. A second man carrying extra ammunition fell to her next shot. But even as she eliminated individual targets, Maria could see that the tactical mathematics were working against her unit. The enemy had achieved what military theorists called culminating point, the moment in battle when attacking forces reach the limit of their offensive capability. But instead of culminating in defeat, the Taliban fighters were culminating in overwhelming local superiority. They had absorbed horrific casualties, but still maintained enough combat power to finish the job. "Alpha, this is Ghost," Maria transmitted, her voice steady despite the desperate nature of their situation. "I'm seeing massive reinforcement from all directions. You need to break contact now, while you still can. I'll provide covering fire for the withdrawal." Rodriguez's response was immediate and predictable. "Negative, Ghost. We're not leaving Martinez and his team. Find us a solution." Maria checked her ammunition status with growing concern. She had fired over 40 rounds, leaving her with fewer than 20 remaining. Against an enemy force that still numbered in the dozens, spread across multiple ridgelines, and approaching from every direction, 20 rounds weren't going to solve the tactical problem. But Maria Santos hadn't survived 18 months of combat deployment by accepting impossible situations as hopeless. She made a decision that would either save her unit or get them all killed. Instead of continuing to engage individual targets as they presented themselves, she was going to force the enemy to mass their personnel in a single location where she could engage them with devastating effect. It was a strategy that required her to use herself as bait, deliberately revealing her position to draw the enemy into a killing ground of her own choosing. "Alpha, I'm about to do something that's either brilliant or insane," she transmitted. "When I give the word, you and Martinez need to move fast toward Rally Point Charlie. Don't question it. Don't hesitate. Just run like your lives depend on it." Rodriguez's voice carried confusion mixed with trust. "What are you planning, Ghost?" Maria was already moving to a new position that would give her a perfect field of fire across the valley floor, while making her completely exposed to return fire from the surrounding ridgelines. It was the kind of tactical suicide that violated every principle of sniper employment, but it was also the only way to create the conditions necessary for her unit's escape. "I'm going to give them a target they can't resist," she replied, settling into a position that would either make her a legend or get her name added to the memorial wall at Fort Bragg. "Just be ready to move when I call it." The ghost was about to step out of the shadows and challenge an entire enemy company to single combat. In the next few minutes, she would either rewrite the book on what was possible for a lone sniper or provide a cautionary tale about the limits of individual heroism in modern warfare. Maria moved to the most exposed position on the rocky outcrop, a flat shelf of stone that offered no concealment, but provided clear fields of fire in every direction. From this position, she could engage targets across the entire valley complex, but she would also be visible to every enemy fighter who looked in her direction. It was the tactical equivalent of painting a bullseye on her back and challenging an entire army to take their best shot. She set up her rifle with deliberate precision, knowing that the next few minutes would test every skill she had ever developed. The morning sun was now high enough to create heat shimmer across the valley floor, adding another variable to calculations that were already at the edge of the possible. But Maria had passed the point where mathematical precision mattered less than absolute determination. "Alpha, Ghost is in position," she transmitted. "When I start shooting, every fighter on this mountainside is going to know exactly where I am. You'll have maybe 3 minutes while they're focused on me. Use it." Rodriguez's voice carried the weight of command responsibility mixed with personal anguish. "Ghost, this is suicide. There has to be another way." Maria chambered around and acquired her first target, a fighter who was moving along the eastern ridge approximately 900 meters away. Through her scope, she could see at least 30 enemy personnel across the surrounding terrain, all of whom would be hunting her position within seconds of her first shot. "Sometimes the mission requires everything we have to give," she replied simply. "Take care of my boys, Captain, and tell my family I did my job." Her first shot was deliberately calculated for maximum psychological impact rather than tactical efficiency. Instead of targeting the closest threat or the most dangerous weapon system, she aimed for a fighter who was positioned on the highest visible point of the eastern ridge. The man was clearly acting as an observer for multiple groups, and his dramatic fall would be visible to fighters across the entire valley complex. The bullet struck perfectly, and the fighter tumbled down the rocky slope in full view of his comrades. The effect was immediate and devastating. Across the ridgelines, enemy fighters began scanning the terrain frantically, trying to locate the source of the impossible shot. Maria used their confusion to acquire her second target. A fighter with a radio was attempting to coordinate a response from a position approximately 800 meters to the north. Maria's shot took him cleanly, and the radio fell silent just as he was beginning to transmit. Before the echo of her shot had faded, she was already engaging a third target. The third fighter was part of a machine gun crew that had been setting up to provide overwatch of the valley floor. Maria's bullet found the gunner just as he was settling behind his weapon, and the entire crew abandoned their position in panic. But Maria could already see the response developing across the mountainside as enemy fighters began to understand what was happening. "Contact!" came the shouts in Pashto that echoed off the rock walls. "Sniper! Single shooter on the western peak!" Automatic weapons fire erupted from dozens of positions as enemy fighters began engaging Maria's location with everything they had. Bullets sparked off the rocks around her position, sending stone fragments whistling through the air like deadly confetti. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous roar of rifle fire punctuated by the distinctive chatter of machine guns and the occasional thump of grenades. But Maria had achieved exactly what she had intended. Every fighter on a mountainside was now focused entirely on eliminating her position, which meant they had temporarily forgotten about the trapped rangers below. She could see Rodriguez and his team beginning their withdrawal, moving fast while the enemy's attention was elsewhere. She continued firing with mechanical precision, engaging targets as fast as she could acquire them, while automatic weapons fire chewed up the rocks around her position. A fighter attempting to maneuver for a flanking shot hit. A group trying to set up a mortar position, scattered by precise rifle fire. A machine gun crew attempting to establish enfilade fire, eliminated before they could complete their setup. But the mathematical reality was becoming clear. Maria had perhaps a dozen rounds remaining, facing an enemy force that was adapting rapidly to her tactics. Several groups had stopped shooting entirely, which meant they were maneuvering for positions that would allow them to engage her effectively. It was only a matter of time before their superior numbers overwhelmed her ability to defend her position. "Alpha, you're clear for withdrawal," she transmitted, working the bolt on her rifle with practiced efficiency. "Martinez's team is mobile. All personnel are accounted for." Rodriguez's voice came back immediately. "Ghost, we're not leaving you. Give us your position, and we'll fight our way to you." Maria allowed herself a moment of grim humor as she engaged another target. The idea of 9 Rangers fighting their way up a mountainside against 40 or 50 enemy fighters was tactically absurd, but it was exactly the kind of impossible mission that Rangers train for their entire careers. "Negative, Alpha," she replied firmly. "Continue withdrawal to Rally Point Charlie. That's an order from your Overwatch element." She could see the enemy's response coordinating across multiple ridgelines. Groups of fighters were beginning to maneuver simultaneously, using suppression fire to mask their movement as they closed in on her position. The professional discipline that had made them such effective ambush predators was now being turned against her with deadly efficiency. A bullet struck the rock inches from her head, sending stone chips across her cheek. Another round sparked off her rifle barrel, leaving a bright scratch in the metal finish. The incoming fire was becoming more accurate as enemy fighters found the range to her position and began to coordinate their efforts. Maria made a tactical decision that surprised even her. Instead of remaining stationary and trying to hold her position through superior marksmanship, she was going to use mobility to extend the engagement and buy additional time for her unit's withdrawal. It was a strategy that went against every principle of sniper employment, but conventional tactics had stopped applying the moment she had decided to use herself as bait. She grabbed her rifle and sprinted to a new position 30 meters away, bullets tracking her movement as enemy fighters tried to lead their target. The new position offered different fields of fire, but the same fundamental problem. She was completely exposed to return fire from multiple directions. From her new location, she could see Rodriguez's team moving rapidly along the western slope, using terrain features to mask their movement while maintaining tactical spacing. They were going to make it to the rally point, assuming she could keep the enemy's attention focused on her position for another few minutes. Maria settled behind her rifle once more and continued the deadly work that had defined her military career. Each shot was calculated for maximum disruption of enemy coordination rather than simple target elimination. She aimed for radio operators, leaders, and weapon crews that were essential to the enemy's tactical cohesion. A fighter with binoculars who was directing fire from multiple positions, eliminated with a shot that sent his optics tumbling down the mountainside. An older man who was clearly coordinating movement between groups, dropped with precision that spoke of years of training and combat experience. A fighter carrying additional ammunition for a machine gun crew hit just as he was reaching his destination. But Maria could feel the tactical situation shifting against her. The enemy had located her position with precision, and they were beginning to mass fires in a way that would make her current location untenable. Bullets were striking the rocks around her position with increasing frequency, and she could hear the distinctive whistle of ricochets as rounds bounced off the stone surfaces. "Ghost, we're at Rally Point Charlie." Rodriguez's voice carried relief mixed with desperate concern. "Air support is inbound. ETA 15 minutes. Can you hold for extraction?" Maria checked her ammunition one final time. 7 rounds remaining in her current magazine, no spare magazines left. 7 bullets against an enemy force that still numbered in the dozens, all of whom were now focused entirely on eliminating her position. She thought about the mathematics of the situation with the cold objectivity that had made her one of the most effective snipers in the army. 7 rounds weren't going to solve the tactical problem, but they might be enough to ensure that her unit reached safety before the enemy could reorganize and pursue. Air support copies. Came a new voice on the radio frequency. Reaper drone with Hellfire missiles, 5 minutes out. Can the sniper mark targets? Maria allowed herself a moment of genuine hope. Close air support would fundamentally change the tactical equation, providing the kind of devastating firepower that could eliminate entire groups of enemy fighters simultaneously. But she had to survive the next 5 minutes for the support to matter. Ghost copies, she transmitted. I can mark targets, but I'm down to my last few rounds. The enemy knows my position, and they're massing for a final assault. As if to emphasize her point, a coordinated volley of automatic weapons fire erupted from the surrounding ridgelines, sending bullets cracking past her position with deadly accuracy. Maria pressed herself against the rock face, feeling fragments of stone shower down around her as dozens of rounds impacted the area she had been occupying seconds earlier. When the firing slackened slightly, she raised her rifle and acquired what would likely be her final target, a fighter who was sprinting across open ground, trying to reach a position that would allow him to engage her with grenades. The range was just under 700 meters, manageable even under these desperate circumstances. Maria controlled her breathing one last time, settled her crosshairs with the precision that had become second nature, and squeezed the trigger. The fighter stumbled and fell, tumbling down the rocky slope as her bullet found its mark. 6 rounds remaining. Reaper 6-1, this is Ghost, she transmitted, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. I can see your targets. Multiple groups on all ridge lines, surrounding grid, November 749er. Friendlies are clear of the target area. Light them up. The distinctive sound of a Hellfire missile in flight was one of the most beautiful things Maria Santos had ever heard. The supersonic projectile struck the eastern ridge with devastating precision, eliminating an entire squad of enemy fighters in a cloud of smoke and debris. Before the echo had faded, a second missile struck the northern approach, scattering another group that had been preparing for a final assault on her position. Multiple secondary explosions came the drone operator's voice. Looks like we hit an ammunition cache. Stand by for additional strikes. Maria used the confusion created by the airstrikes to engage her final targets. A fighter who was trying to escape the devastation on the eastern ridge hit. Another who was attempting to coordinate a withdrawal, eliminated before he could complete his radio transmission. With her final round, she engaged a fighter who was trying to recover weapons from his fallen comrades. 5 rounds, 3 hits, 2 clean misses at extreme range under combat conditions. It was shooting that would have been respectable on a training range, extraordinary under combat conditions, and absolutely legendary given the tactical circumstances. Ghost, this is Alpha. Rodriguez's voice carried emotion that he was trying hard to suppress. Extraction bird is inbound. We're coming to get you. Maria looked around at the devastation that surrounded her position. The airstrikes had broken the enemy's coordination completely, turning what had been a coordinated assault into scattered groups of survivors trying to escape the killing ground. Bodies were scattered across the ridgelines, testimony to the deadliest individual marksmanship display in the history of modern warfare. 50 enemy fighters had entered the valley that morning, confident in their ability to eliminate a small patrol of American Rangers. 47 of them would never leave. The 3 survivors would carry stories of the Ghost back to their commanders, tales of impossible shots and deadly precision that would grow in the telling until they became legend. Maria Santos had fired 68 rounds over the course of 4 hours, achieving a hit rate that defied statistical analysis under conditions that challenged every aspect of her training and equipment. More importantly, she had brought 8 Rangers home alive through a combination of individual skill and collective courage that exemplified the warrior ethos at its finest. As the extraction helicopter descended toward the rally point, Maria gathered her equipment and prepared to rejoin her unit. The mission that had begun as a routine patrol had become something else entirely, a testament to what was possible when training, determination, and brotherhood combined under the most desperate circumstances. The Ghost was going home, but the legend of the sniper who had eliminated 50 enemies from 1,200 meters would echo through the mountains of Afghanistan for generations to come. In the warrior culture that had shaped these peaks for thousands of years, few stories would command greater respect than that of the American woman who had stood alone against an army and emerged victorious. Years later, when military historians studied the engagement that became known as the Battle of Ghost Ridge, they would struggle to explain how a single sniper had achieved tactical effects that typically required entire companies of infantry, supported by artillery and air power. The mathematics simply didn't support what had actually happened in those mountains. But Maria Santos knew something that couldn't be quantified in after-action reports or calculated through ballistic formulas. She knew that sometimes the mission requires everything a warrior has to give, and that the bonds between soldiers can create possibilities that transcend the limitations of individual capability. She had been asked to protect 8 Rangers, and she had brought them home. Everything else was just detail for the history books.